So let's go through all these steps which are outlined in the app.js file. I will actually leave this list here, as you can see, a normal ordered list, so that we can always glimpse at our tasks. And the first task is to create two new components, user input and user output. So in the source folder, which is where we write our React code, I'll create two new folders, user input and next to it, user output. And I choose these names because these should be the component names. And as you learned, it is a good practice to name the folders and files according to what you want to name your component. So inside the user input folder, I'm going to create a user input.js file. Inside user output, it's the user output.js file. So with that, we already solved task number one and we created the components. Now, of course, these components aren't that useful, and actually we only created files. These aren't really components. Now we should add something there, return some JSX code in the components, and for that we need to create real components to begin with. I'm going to start with the user input, and you learned that you basically have two different ways of creating a component. Extending the component object provided by React, or simply creating a function. You also learned that you should try to use a function as often as possible to have a basically representational only component, which just returns some JSX in the end. And you mostly need to extend the component if you want to manipulate state. I want to manipulate state in neither the user input nor the user output component. So I'll create functions in both of them. I'll create a user input function, camel case notation to follow the convention, and this will simply be stored in this constant user input. It's a ES6 arrow function as you learned it, and you also learned one other important thing which can easily be forgotten. You need to import React from React in any component you create. This is required because the JSX code you return is in the end converted to React create element. Speaking of returning something, here I want to return something, and if we have a look at our assignment, we should return an input element in there. So let's just do that. No need to wrap it in a div, we can just return an input, maybe of type text, just like that. And of course, to be able to use this component, I need to export it. And I will simply define the default export of this file to be that in user input constant, which simply is my function, which returns my JSX. That's the user input. Let's save this file. Let's now work on the user output. And there we should return two paragraphs, for now with any text of your choice. So again, I will create a constant, which I'll name user output, which will hold a reference, or which will store this function, I should say. As before, we need to import React from React to prevent errors. And then I want to return something. And here I will return a wrapping div because I want to have multiple elements sit next to each other. And whilst React 16 actually will support returning arrays, it is still a good practice and actually required to wrap multiple elements sitting next to each other without them being in an array like this. So here I will have a div wrapping my component, and now in there I want to have two paragraphs. So let me quickly create both and duplicate it. And here I will output some random text and some more random text. With that, let's save this file too. And now we need to use these components. We right now completed the second task. Now we should output multiple user output components in our app component. And actually, why don't we also output the user input component already? So in app.js, I want to import my new components. So I'll import user input. And as I mentioned earlier, this name is up to you, but you should use your component name there and start with a capital character to not confuse React. So I'll import that from /user input, and there the user input.js file where you can omit the file extension since it is a JavaScript file. The same for the user output. Import user output from /user output, and there the user output file without the extension. Now I'll leave the instructions in there, but below my ordered list, I actually will now add my user input, a self-closing tag, and also my user output, another self-closing tag. And I'll duplicate this twice to have 3 user outputs. Let's save the app.js file, and let's see. I now get an error. Export default not found in user output. This actually makes sense, because I forgot to add my export here. Of course, having the function in the user output file like this isn't worth anything. To be able to access it from another file, I need to export it, in this case, doing it with the default export of this file. Now with that being saved, it does work. We see the input, and then we see 3 times our user output component. So this is task number 3 solved. Now we want to add something else and leave the world of static content. We want to pass a username to the user output component via props. Well, you learned how to do that. We can simply add a username property, maybe written like that, whatever you like. The name is totally up to you. Could also be username. It's your choice after all. So I'll use username, and here I will simply pass max. And you could pass different usernames for the different components now. I will actually pass the same. But as you learned over the last lectures, you can of course pass different data, and that is a common pattern to do. Typically your components should render the same JSX, but with dynamic content. Here I'll take the same username. We're going to overwrite this with the state soon anyways. And of course, passing it like this is only one step. We want to output it too. So save the app.js file, and let's move on to the user output file. There we know that we can get access to the props passed in by React by accepting an argument in that function and then output it. And now let's add something to the paragraphs here. Now, we don't get any instructions where to add what or what to do with it, simply that we should display the username in the user output. So why don't we simply say username colon, and then you learned how to pass or to output dynamic content. Single curly braces. Between the single curly braces opening and closing, you access props, username, and make sure that the name you use here and the casing you use here matches name and casing of your attribute here. And one important information, in normal HTML, the attributes are case insensitive. So this as a normal HTML attribute wouldn't work. But keep in mind, we're not using normal HTML here. This is just syntactic sugar, so we can use case sensitive names. So in user output, we're outputting this here. Now let's save this, and we should see username max, max, and max 3 times, or however often you used your user output component. So this is task 4 solved. The next task is to actually manage the username via state and pass it via state to our component. Now, nothing easier than that. You learned how to add and use state. You also learned that you can't access state in function components or components written as a function. Now, of course, we could convert it into a component which extends the component object provided by React, but you also learned that it's a good thing to have many components in this function form and manage the state in a few central places in your app, so-called containers. Now we have such a container already. App.js is a normal React component, but since it extends the component object provided by React, it effectively is such a container. And keep in mind, container is just how you name it. It's not a special object you have to create or inherit from. So we have a component which extends component, and that is the app.js file or the component in that file. Therefore, we can add state here, and you learned that state is just a property of your class. Just as render is a method, we can also add our state property here. And state should just be a JavaScript object in our case. Here, I will set up a username property, and I'll write it all lowercase just to have a distinction to the prop. You could use it in the camel case notation, nothing wrong with that. and I'll name it Supermax here. Sounds like a good username for me. Now with that, I want to pass that username and the state to my props. So down there where I use my user output, I'll now pass something dynamic, this state username, all lowercase since this is how I defined username there. And I'll actually replace all 3 props with it, though I wouldn't need to do that. I could also leave one to be hard-coded. Well, maybe we do that. It's totally up to you. So with that, if we save this and we go back to the application, we see Supermax, Supermax, and Max. So we're successfully using the state. We're not really using it to update it though. We're not able to change it yet. We'll start with this in task 6 though. We add a method to manipulate the state, an event handler method to be precise. Now, it still is a regular method. The event handler addition is only important to keep in mind for naming the method according to the convention. So here, this should be triggered whenever we type something into that input in the user input component. So what would be a fitting name for that method? Maybe simply input changed handler or something like username changed handler, whatever you like. Now we'll define this as a property which holds a function, a ES6 arrow function, effectively turning this into a method. Now, if you closely watched, you might also have recognized that render also is a method, but uses a different syntax. You can use both syntaxes, either this property which holds a function syntax here, or this syntax which looks more like methods are written in other languages. There's one important difference though. If you plan on using the this keyword inside the method, as we do plan to do here, you should use this syntax where you have a property and assign a function. Because this will basically encapsulate the this keyword to still refer to the class which you want to do to get access to the state and so on. With a method defined like this, generally this inside of it will still refer to the class, as you can clearly see down here. But if you execute it as an event listener, as we plan to do for a username changed handler, this would no longer refer to the class, simply due to the way how JavaScript works when executing code at runtime. So therefore, we should use this syntax for our event handlers. For our methods, it doesn't really matter, and you might use this syntax or this syntax. Both will work there. So enough of the talking about the syntaxes. Let's see what we should do with it. We should add a method to manipulate the state and basically change the state based on the input we get. Now we know that we will receive an event here because we plan on using this as an event listener method. So here I can call this set state to manipulate the state. And that's important. Keep in mind to call set state and don't directly manipulate the state. This will not work and is strictly wrong. Set state, provided by that component object by React, will merge whatever you pass here with your existing state, safely overwrite it or adjust it, and inform React that the state was changed and that it should check if it needs to update the DOM. So here we want to set username, actually the only property we have in our state, to event target value. As you know, event target will refer to the element the event occurred on, and value is a valid property we may access since we know that event target will be an input element which has a value property containing the value the user entered. This alone will update the state and will inform React that the state changed. It will then check if it needs to change this part here, this code. And actually it doesn't because we never output anything from the state here. But we do pass it as props to the user output component, and it will check all of its child elements too. For user input, it will, right now at least, determine that it doesn't need to update it. But for user output, it knows that we get props, and if props change, which they do because we change the state which we send via props, it will re-render this part here. This is how it will work behind the scenes, though I will have a whole module where I dive deeper into what happens exactly behind the scenes in case you're interested in that. So for now we get a method which we can call, which would update the state. Of course, we need to call it though. We added the method to manipulate the state. Now we should pass the event handler method reference to the user input component and bind it to the inputted change event there. So on user input, maybe we should pass a property we name changed, and the name is totally up to you. This is no reserved word. It's just a prop defined by you. And there I will pass this username changed handler without parentheses. Don't add parentheses. You don't want to execute it here. You just want to pass a reference to this method. In the user input method, we now also receive props here, so let's accept them as an argument. And on the input, we now listen to the onChange event, which is provided by React. And there, I want to pass the props changed property. That's the property we just set up here, and this refers to that event handler. So by passing a reference to that prop, we actually pass a reference to the event handler. So this event, or this method, excuse me, will get executed whenever the onChange event occurs. Also, don't add parentheses here. You don't want to execute this right at the time this gets rendered to the DOM, but at the point of time this event occurs. It will automatically pass the event object to our event handler, as you learned. Now with that, let's save the user input component and make sure all the other files are saved too. And now let's see if this actually works. We already completed this task where we ensured that the input entered by the user overrides the old username. We do this here with setState. Make sure that npm start is running in the project, and thereafter simply enter something here, like test. And you see that in all the components where I did pass state as the username, or state username as the username, it will overwrite it. It won't overwrite it down here, because max there is simply hard-coded. Now let's also set up two-way binding, so that when we load the application, we also actually see our current username, supermax, in the input field, instead of an empty input. Now for that, in the user input, here I simply have to bind the value property to something I need to pass as props. For that, I'll simply restructure this over multiple lines just to make it easier to read, and then pass props, and there maybe simply value. You could choose any other name though, so maybe also current name to have a clear distinction to this value, which is a reserved name because it's in a default HTML element. Now let's use that current name prop, which I defined here in app.js, and let's pass it here, current name. Let's also split this over multiple lines to make it easier to read. And there, the current name, of course, is the current username stored in the state, just like we pass it to user output on a different property there though. Let's save this, and as it reloads, we see supermax, and we can start changing it. If you open the developer tools, you also see that this time we don't get a warning in the console, because unlike to the lectures prior to the assignment, here we only use this two-way binding in cases where we do actually provide a change handler and the value. With that, we are almost done. The missing piece is the styling, and here you are totally free to use whichever styling you want. Now, I will use two different approaches. For the user input, where I don't have a wrapping element, I will set up some inline styles to make sure that the styling only gets applied to this input and not to any other input I might have in my application, even though I don't have one here. So here, style is a JavaScript object, and I will simply give my input a border which is, let's say, 2 pixels wide, solid, and red. And I assign it by using the default style property, which is known on this HTML, or I should say JSX element. And I assign my style variable up here as a value. And the name is totally up to you. You could also name this input style to not confuse it with the property or attribute you are assigning it to. So that is inline styles being used in user input. As you learned, the advantage is this is now really scoped to this input only. If I were to use an input anywhere else in my application, this style would not get applied because in the end, we apply it as an inline style. For the user output, I'll follow a different approach. I'll add a CSS file, user output, and I'll add a user output CSS class. There, I simply want to have a width of, let's say, 60%. I want to have a padding of 16 pixels and a margin of 16 pixels. I want to have a border of 2 pixels, solid and black, and a background color of this gray. And I want to set text align to center maybe. And you can choose any styling you want. Now, just by doing that, we're not going to see any styling at all. We have to go to the component we want to style and first of all, import our style sheet. We're not importing anything from there. We just import the overall sheet by passing it as a relative path with file extension, and Webpack, the build tool getting used behind the scenes, will automatically take care of it and include it correctly in our page. This alone still won't style anything, because all we do in there is we define this user output CSS class. So we should use this class then. We can do this here on this wrapping div. There, I'll set the class name, not to something dynamic, but to a hard-coded string, user output, the class I defined in here. Now important, this also shows why wrapping your component in one root element makes a lot of sense and is not just an annoying requirement. It makes it easy to assign a style to your component. Now make sure all the files you edited are saved. You have no dots on any of these files. And now let's go back. And here indeed we see our styled components with the style sheet and the input with the inline style with the red border. And of course it still works as before, now with our custom styling, which you might be able to improve from a layout and design perspective. But from a learning perspective, I'd say you learned a lot about the base syntax of React. Now let's continue and dive deeper into what you can do, especially how we can render content dynamically, or conditionally I should say, depending on some conditions, or how we can output lists of data.